Alright, so now we want to explain how undercoverage, non-response, question wording, and other aspects of a sample survey can lead to bias. Okay, bias is where the results do not really reflect. They either underrepresent what the attitude of the population, or they overrepresent the attitude of a population. Okay, so inference. The purpose of the sample purpose of a sample is to gather information about a population. Okay? We draw conclusions about the population based on the results from a sample. Okay? This is called inference. We are inferring something to be true. We know what's true about a sample, and then we infer it to be true about the entire population. Okay, now not all surveys are right. We've already talked about how surveys, things that can go wrong. We've talked about a voluntary response survey, very voluntary response sample where people choose themselves to be in the sample, or a convenience sample where we choose a bunch of people at the mall, and the people that go at the mall have no chance of being chosen. So those are things that certainly can go wrong. Okay. Now, they certainly can lead to bias, but there are certain things that happen we call undercoverage. Undercoverage is when some members of a population cannot be chosen. Or even if they just have a lesser chance of being chosen, we're going to have some undercoverage. So maybe you have some, certain people are harder to reach. If you're going to do things, you're going to do a phone survey. Well, people without phones can't be reached. Okay. In a phone survey, people without phones are undercovered. Okay. Non-response. That's exactly what it sounds like. When individuals chosen refuse to participate or cannot be reached. Okay? When they refuse to participate or they cannot be reached, that would be non-response. Alright, so let's look at some examples here. Women, Love, and Non-Response. In 1988, Sherry Hite published a book entitled Women in Love, A Cultural Revolution in Progress, in which she claimed that 70% of women who had been married 5 or more years were having extramarital affairs. Hite's survey was sent to 100,000 women, and her conclusions were based on the 4,500 women who responded. What was the non-response rate for this study? How might this non-response have affected the results of the survey? So if only 4,500 women responded, that means the vast majority, or if we take 100,000 minus 4,500, that's 95,500 women that did not respond out of the 100,000 that she wanted to survey. Okay. So that's 95.5%. The non-response rate was 95.5% non-response rate. Okay. Now, how might this non-response rate have affected the results of the survey? Okay. Well, we can't assume that these 4,500 are representative of all women, number one. Okay, and it really is a voluntary response sample because the women chose to respond and weren't directly approached by the researcher. Okay, so it's safe to assume that these 4,500 who responded have stronger feelings than most women. Okay. Therefore, the 70% rate is likely to overestimate the actual value. It's probably not 70% of women were having extramarital affairs. It's probably a significant number less than that. Okay? But these 4,500 they're probably women who have had experiences and are just sharing their experiences. But if you've got 90, maybe you might have 95,000 that have never cheated. All right. Bad wording. Okay. So how a question is worded certainly, okay, can affect the answers you get. Now, if you ask college students these two questions, how happy are you in general? Okay. And then, you might say from 1 to 5. And then, how many dates did you have last month? Now, the order in which you ask those questions could drastically affect the answers that you get. It says, if you ask them first, how happy are you in general, they may give you one answer. But if you say, how many dates have you had in the last month, and they say 0, and then you say, how happy are you in general, they might go, well, I guess I'm not all that happy. Or in other words, the answer to the how many dates did you have could affect their view of how happy they are in general. So that's just when you're talking about wording. Okay? That's just one way of just the order. Okay, so changes in wording can greatly affect the outcome of a study. Okay, so let's look at an example of that. How do Americans feel about health care reform? During the middle of the drive to pass health care reform legislation in July 2010, several different polling organizations attempt to measure the sentiments of Americans. A New York Times CBS poll found that 66% supported a government-administered health insurance plan. Well, that would make it a majority of the American people. Something like Medicare coverage that people 65 and older get. However, a Fox News poll found that only 44% supported a government-run health insurance plan. Now, the only difference here is this one says administered, and this one says run. When you hear administered, you might think the government's not really in charge of it. They're just kind of, it's run by other people, but they just kind of oversee it. Okay, but if you see here a government-run health insurance plan, you might think the government's a little more involved than you might with a administered. Okay, so you can see right there how the disparate results, and we don't even know that it's intentional on the part of the pollsters. Just that's how they worded their question. And so we have to make sure that when we look at a question, how does the wording affect how people are answering? All right. So let's look at another one. A badly worded question seemed to indicate that nearly 1/3 of all Americans had some doubt that the Holocaust occurred. Here was the question that the Roper Polling Organization asked in 1992. Does it seem possible, or does it seem impossible to you that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? Only 65% said it was impossible that it never happened. Okay, but notice the confusing way that question is written. Does it seem possible, or does it seem impossible that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? That's a double negative. Okay, and so that's a difficult question to understand. You can see how that question would be difficult to understand. And when the question was revised and they redid the question, the percentage who were certain that the Holocaust occurred dramatically increased. Okay? So it's very important that we do things in the correct fashion